You're nothing but a man who lives off his wife's paycheck. My father-in-law said it loud enough for the entire table to hear, right between the mashed potatoes and the wine he'd poured for everyone except me. 12 people went silent. My wife's aunt actually laughed into her napkin. My mother-in-law didn't defend me, she just nodded slowly, like he'd finally said what everyone at that table had been thinking for 3 years. I sat there in my one good shirt, the one I'd ironed that morning because I wanted to look respectable at my own wife's family Thanksgiving, and I said nothing. I smiled. I even took another bite of turkey. What none of them knew was that I wasn't idle. I wasn't broke. And in 4 months, every single person laughing at that table would be asking me for a favor they couldn't afford to be refused. Welcome back to Dad's Cruel Revenge. Grab your snacks, get comfortable, because every villain in this story got exactly what they deserved. Be sure to subscribe and drop a comment. What would you have done in my place? My name is Nathan Reeves. I'm 36. I drive a 10-year-old truck, wear the same 3 flannel shirts on rotation, and never correct anyone who assumes I'm broke. Frank Delaney, my father-in-law, built his whole identity around being the successful one in the family. He had no idea that the nothing he insulted at that table was quietly worth more than his entire real estate portfolio. My wife, Claire, and I met at a community college 8 years ago, back when I was working construction and she was studying nursing. We got married young, by her family's standards, no big church wedding, no country club reception, just a courthouse ceremony and a dinner at the restaurant where we'd had our second date. Frank never forgave us for that. He'd wanted Claire to marry someone from his social circle, someone with a title on a business card, someone he could introduce at his golf club without hesitation. Instead, Claire fell in love with a guy who wore work boots and came home smelling like sawdust. Frank made his disapproval clear from day one, in small comments disguised as jokes, then bigger ones as the years passed. He assumed, because I didn't wear a suit or talk about a corner office, that I had nothing. He never once asked what I actually did for a living beyond construction, and I never volunteered more, because frankly, Frank never earned the right to know. What he didn't know was that 4 years ago, I'd left swinging a hammer for someone else and started my own commercial renovation company, specializing in restaurant and retail build-outs. It grew fast, quietly, the way real businesses do when you're not spending money on appearances. I drove the same truck because I liked that truck, not because I couldn't afford another one. Frank's contempt was built entirely on assumptions he never bothered to check. Thanksgiving at the Delaney house was always a production. China Frank's wife only used twice a year, a seating chart, wine Frank selected specifically to talk about at length. I'd learned to get through it by staying quiet, letting Frank hold court, nodding when required. That year, something shifted. Frank had just closed a big commercial property deal, and he wanted an audience for his victory lap. You know what separates men who build something and men who just get by, he said, refilling his own glass, deliberately skipping mine. Ambition. Some men have it. Some men just marry into comfort and call it a living. The table went quiet in that specific way rooms go quiet when everyone knows exactly who a comment is aimed at. Claire's hand found my knee under the table, a silent apology. You're nothing but a man who lives off his wife's paycheck, Frank said directly to me, finally, no longer hiding behind a general statement. Claire's mother nodded along. Her brother smirked into his wine glass. I looked around that table, 12 faces, most of them not even meeting my eyes, and I felt something settle in my chest, cold and clear. Not anger, exactly. Clarity. I smiled, said pass the gravy, please, and let the conversation move on. Frank thought he'd won something. He had no idea what he'd just started. I didn't say anything to Claire that night about what I was planning, mostly because I hadn't planned anything yet. The idea arrived slowly, over the following week, while I sat in my own office looking at a permit application for my company's next project, a full commercial renovation for a restaurant group opening 3 new locations, one of them 2 blocks from Frank's own real estate office. Frank, it turned out, had been trying for over a year to land a leasing deal with that same restaurant group for a different property he owned, a vacant commercial building he'd been unable to fill for 18 months, bleeding money on taxes and maintenance the whole time. Claire mentioned it in passing one evening, not realizing the significance. Dad stressed about that empty building downtown. Nobody wants it, apparently. Bad layout or something. I already knew the building. My company had actually toured it 8 months earlier, before the restaurant group I worked with chose a different location instead, the one I was now contracted to renovate. Frank's failure and my success were connected by a thread neither of us had noticed yet, sitting 2 blocks apart on the same downtown street. I didn't say a word to Claire about any of this. I just quietly started making calls. Over the next several weeks, I worked my actual job the way I always did, showing up in work boots, running my crews, staying invisible to people like Frank who never looked twice at a man in a tool belt. Behind that, I did something else entirely. I reached out to the restaurant group's regional director, a man named Marcus Whitfield I'd built a strong relationship with over 3 successful build-outs. I asked Marcus, casually, whether they'd look seriously at other downtown properties before settling on their current site. He mentioned Frank's building specifically, said the layout issues were fixable, but Frank's asking price and unwillingness to negotiate lease terms had killed the deal early. I didn't reveal my connection to Frank. I simply asked good questions, the kind a contractor asks when scouting future project opportunities, and let Marcus talk. I learned Frank's building had actually generated real interest twice, both times falling apart over Frank's rigid terms and his refusal to invest in basic renovation costs upfront, the same renovation work my company specialized in. Frank wasn't losing deals because the building was bad. He was losing deals because he was too proud, or too cheap, to fix it properly. I now had 2 things Frank desperately needed and didn't know I possessed: a relationship with the exact client he wanted, and the renovation expertise to make his building sellable. I just needed the right moment to make that visible. I let 3 more months pass. Frank's building sat empty through the winter, and family dinners came with fresh commentary about it, Frank complaining loudly about worthless downtown real estate and tenants with no vision, never once connecting his failure to his own stubbornness. I sat through every comment quietly, the same way I'd sat through lives off his wife's paycheck, filing each one away. Then Marcus called me directly with news. The restaurant group was expanding faster than planned and actively searching for a 4th location, specifically downtown. I asked if Frank's building, describing it only by address, not by owner, might still be viable if renovation costs were handled properly. Marcus said absolutely, if the right contractor could turn the layout around fast and the owner would finally negotiate seriously. I told Marcus I knew a highly motivated seller at that address and that I could personally guarantee both a renovation timeline and a serious conversation about terms. Marcus agreed to a meeting. Then I called Frank directly for the first time in months, using a tone I'd never used with him before, calm, businesslike, completely unbothered. "Frank, it's Nathan. I hear you've got a vacant building downtown. I think I can get you a tenant. I'll need you to hear me out completely before you say anything." The silence on his end lasted almost 10 full seconds. Frank agreed to meet, mostly out of desperation and mild curiosity, still assuming this was some kind of favor request from his broke son-in-law. He suggested his office, clearly wanting home field advantage. I walked in wearing a clean button-down instead of my usual flannel, carrying a folder with renderings and a renovation proposal my team had put together weeks earlier for exactly this kind of building. "I own a commercial renovation company," I said, sliding the folder across his desk. "We've done build-outs for 3 restaurant groups downtown, including the one that's been circling your building twice and walking away both times because of layout and your pricing." Frank's face shifted from confusion to something more careful. "I have a direct relationship with their regional director. I can bring you a serious tenant within 30 days, but only if you're willing to actually invest in fixing the layout instead of hoping someone ignores it." Frank stared at the renderings, at the company letterhead, my name listed as founder and owner, and I watched him do the math on every lives off his wife's paycheck comment he'd made across 3 years of dinners. "This is yours?" he asked quietly. "I built it from nothing, the same nothing you kept describing at your dinner table," I said. "I'm not here for an apology, Frank. I'm here for a business deal. You need this. I don't need anything from you at all." Frank tried, briefly, to negotiate from a position of authority out of pure habit, suggesting a reduced rate given the family connection. I told him plainly that family discounts didn't apply to a man who'd spent 3 years publicly humiliating me at his own dinner table, and that my rate for this project was identical to what I charged any other client, full price, standard timeline, standard contract, no favors. He pushed back once, mentioning that surely, given everything, I could show some flexibility, for Claire's sake. I told him Claire had nothing to do with this conversation, and that invoking her now, after using her paycheck as a punchline for years, wasn't going to move me an inch. Frank went quiet, recalculating, staring at a folder that represented his only realistic path out of an 18-month financial bleed. He signed the contract 2 days later, full price, my standard terms, a 60-day renovation timeline. I brought Marcus back to the table exactly as promised. The restaurant group signed a 10-year lease within 3 weeks of walking through the renovated space. Frank's worthless downtown real estate, the building he'd complained about at every family gathering for over a year, became fully leased, generating steady income for the first time since he'd bought it. And every dollar of renovation profit that made it possible went straight into my company's account, not his. The next family dinner landed differently. Frank tried, clumsily, to introduce me to his business associates as my son-in-law, the contractor who turned my downtown building around. No mention of lives off his wife's paycheck, no mention of nothing, just a careful, revised version of me that erased 3 years of contempt in a single sentence. I let him say it. I didn't correct the framing or demand credit for what he'd conveniently forgotten to acknowledge. Claire's mother, who'd nodded along at every insult before, now asked polite questions about my company, about hiring, about whether we ever needed extra office help, clearly fishing for relevance. Claire's brother, who'd smirked into his wine glass at that Thanksgiving table, asked if my company was looking for any investors, a question so transparently self-serving I almost laughed out loud at the table. I answered every question politely, briefly, and declined every offer without explanation. I wasn't interested in their sudden respect any more than I'd been wounded by their previous contempt. Both reactions were about the same thing, what I could apparently provide them, not who I actually was. Frank sat at the head of that same table, the china out again, the wine poured for everyone including me this time, and said nothing else about ambition or paychecks for the rest of the night. What Frank learned too late. Word travels fast in small business circles, and within a few months, 2 other property owners Frank knew socially had heard the story how Frank Delaney's broke son-in-law had quietly bailed out his failing downtown building and walked away with full payment and zero gratitude extended. Frank's version of the story, when he told it at his golf club, conveniently left out the lives off his wife's paycheck comment that started the whole chain of events. I didn't correct his version publicly. I didn't need to. Claire heard the real story from me directly, calmly, without drama, and she was furious on my behalf in a way I hadn't expected, not at the years of comments I'd absorbed silently, but at how long she'd let herself believe her father's careless comments were harmless family teasing rather than what they actually were. Claire had a conversation with her father I wasn't present for, but I know it was direct, because Frank's tone toward me changed permanently after it, cautious, deliberately respectful, the tone of a man who'd finally learned that contempt has a cost, even when the person absorbing it never says a word in his own defense. Frank never apologized directly. Men like Frank rarely do. But he never called me nothing again, not once, not even in private, according to Claire. A year later, Frank asked if I'd handled the renovation on a second property he'd acquired, framing it as keeping business in the family now. I told him, calmly, that my schedule was full for the next 8 months, which was true, and that he was welcome to submit a formal proposal like any other client, which was also true. I never said no directly. I simply stopped making myself convenient for a man who'd spent 3 years making me feel small at his own dinner table. Claire asked me once, gently, if I still felt angry about that Thanksgiving. I told her the truth, I didn't feel angry anymore, because anger requires still caring what Frank thinks of me, and I'd stopped caring the moment his contract landed on my desk with his signature on it. What I felt instead was simpler. Settled. Frank spent years measuring my worth by a truck, a flannel shirt, and an assumption he never bothered to verify. The correction, when it came, cost him full market rate and every ounce of leverage he thought he had over me. I still drive the same truck. I still wear flannel to job sites. Nothing about who I am changed after that Thanksgiving. Only what Frank was permitted to say about it out loud, ever again, changed completely. Some men measure worth by watches, suits, and corner offices, and they build entire personalities around judging anyone who doesn't perform success the way they expect it. Frank Delaney judged me for 3 years based on a truck and a tool belt, never once asking what I actually did, never once earning the right to know. His contempt cost him nothing until the exact moment it cost him everything full price, on my terms, with his own signature at the bottom of the page. I didn't need Frank's apology. I didn't need his respect either. I needed him to sit at his own dinner table, across from the son-in-law he'd called nothing, and sign a contract that proved exactly how wrong he'd been, in numbers even a man like Frank couldn't argue with. If someone humiliates you at a dinner table for what they assume you have, let them keep assuming, until the day they need you more than you'll ever need them.